Hello, welcome to Picture Me Coding with Erik and Mike Moll. Hi, Mike. Good to see you again this week.
Hey there.
Mike, last week we talked about your background, where you came from, your career, the early part of your career. And this week we were going to continue that story, and we're going to get to the part eventually, I think, where you and I met, right?
Yes, we have a long way to go to get there, though.
You said at the end of last week, we've only made it to 1992, and my math isn't so great, but I think that might have been 30 years ago.
And you were what, like 5?
I was not that young. No, I was more teenager life. Before we get started, I did want to mention, listeners, if you are enjoying the show and you'd like to support the show, we have a Patreon subscription membership available. The Patreon membership is a $4 a month support, so you can buy Mike and I a cup of coffee every month, and your contributions will go towards supporting the show. And we'd like to thank our Patreon subscribers who've signed up, patreon.com, Picture Me Coding. Also, if you want to reach us, feel free to send us an email, podcast@picturemecoding.com. All right, Mike, set the stage for me. Take me all the way back in time to a magical period sometimes people refer to as the 90s. What was it like back then?
It was pretty bleak. No, it was a good time. I was still young and hopeful.
Before your hopes and dreams got crushed?
Yeah, before the system knocked me down.
So you were working at the San Diego Supercomputer Center, and that sounds unlike pretty much any job experience I've heard anybody ever tell. But you went from there to more traditional software engineering roles, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, so it was really cool to work there because of all the interesting people and interesting projects. But it did have one drawback from my perspective, which was that it was still more or less a research institution. And if you've ever worked in a research institution, it's tricky to do software in a research environment because you tend to be chasing grants a lot of the time. And so you'd get a grant and you'd work on the software for that grant, and then you need to get follow-on money, and the project that you're working on would go by the wayside or get, put on a back burner. And I reached a point after about 5 years where I wanted to work in, a real software development environment where people were making a software product. And
Hmm.
I didn't really know what that meant. It wasn't a situation where I could go into like banking or something. I knew I was probably going to have to stay in a field that was relatively close to stuff that I knew. But fortunately, living in this part of the world, there were opportunities like that.
So this is about 1992.
Yeah, 92, I think. I got a job at a company that was making software for the field of computational chemistry.
Oh, so you're still in chemistry, still pretty close to chemistry. Haven't left that yet.
That's right. But they were selling to a commercial market. And so they were doing the normal things that a software company would do. They had a QA environment, and we weren't really doing code reviews yet, but, a lot of the people there were professional software engineers. It was still probably about half the people there were people with doctorates in either physics or chemistry, but there was a significant fraction also of people who came out of computer science environments and
Hmm.
had software engineering experience. So
So you go work for a company that's actually producing software to sell it. What practices at that company would be familiar to someone today, someone like me? And are there practices that would look really bizarre and weird?
around coding, most of the stuff that we do now would seem fairly familiar. This place was doing almost all their work in C. There was some Fortran as well because some of the products that the company used had come out of academic environments.
So they're
But
using VS Code, writing C.
no, but there were a lot of people already using VI and Emacs. So
Okay, VI and Emacs.
most of the code was in C. This was a pretty much a specialty market, and so most of the software is being written for pretty high-end workstations. Most of the work I did was on Silicon Graphics workstations, which
Oh, SGI.
yeah,
My uncle worked there for a little bit.
not a company that exists anymore, but at the time they sort of owned the market for high-end graphics workstations. And
They were a
If
powerhouse. People had huge amounts of respect for them.
Yeah, they were a big deal at the time. And if you work with OpenGL today, that's one of the last remnants of the SGI world.
But I still want to kind of paint a picture, though. Let's say you go to work, you're going to work on this C code base. It's probably one giant monolithic code base, right? You don't have multiple small C code bases. You got this big C thing.
Um,
You open your Emacs editor. You don't have Git, so what are you doing? You're how do you get a change
so
deployed?
we did have revision control. It was obviously long before Git. I think when I started there, we were using RCS and then eventually moved to CVS. But yeah, those are things that are not in wide use anymore. But
You wouldn't have branches, right? So you have the whole code base. You check it out, a
you
portion
could.
of it.
So the way that a lot of those systems worked back then was you would check out a code base or you would check out a file in the code base and you essentially owned that file. So other people couldn't really
It's like
check
you've
it out.
locked it.
Yeah, it's basically locking that file. And then CVS came along. So CVS stands for concurrent version system, and it did give you the ability to have multiple people working on the same code and do merges and so forth. But so it was considerably different than Git, but there was revision control. There was QA. We had a QA department. This was in the days. This was pre-cloud, obviously. So deployment meant taking it from your workstation that you were working on in your cubicle and putting it on some other workstation that was designated for the QA team and them testing it. And production was not pushing it out to Kubernetes. It was putting it onto some physical media and then packaging it in a box with hard copy manuals and then wrapping the whole thing in shrink wrap and and
Those
mailing it
boxes
off
were
to the
often
customer.
white. I'm imagining a big white box. You open it up, and inside is much smaller, like a disc in there.
Yeah, it might have even been a tape in those days.
Wow.
Since this was special, it was expensive and specialty software. And so there was probably also, for a lot of these customers, there was like an aspect where somebody from the company would actually go to their facility and help them set it up and train them on
Oh,
using
okay.
it and things like that. So,
Okay.
a few years down the line, we'd reached the point where we were sending out CD-ROMs and people could set up stuff for themselves. But when I first started there, it was there would have probably been an implementation aspect when somebody purchased this software.
You probably had some gnarly make files to build the thing on your machine. Maybe it takes a long time to build. I'm
Yeah.
also curious too. You're going to make a contribution. Does anybody actually read the code? I mean, do you do code reviews? How does that even work?
So at the time I started there wasn't really the idea of code review. There's no equivalent of like a pull request. I actually went through this phase where I was convinced that we were not doing quite enough around code quality, and I kind of
Annoyed a bunch of people? That's what it sounds like you're going. That's the
yeah,
direction it sounds like you're
I
going in.
I kind of annoyed a bunch of people by suggesting that we do code review and then we do more formal processes.
So what would that be like? It's like you go to a room and you have to project somehow. Like you didn't have
Yeah,
like telemeeting technology. So you want to show everybody what you got on your machine. What did you
yeah,
do? I'm just trying to put myself in there, and it's like there's all these little tools that we use on a day-to-day basis that you didn't have the benefit of. And so
yeah.
I'm sure you solved these. I'm sure you did these same things. I'm just trying to imagine what it would have been like.
No Slack.
That sounds wonderful.
We were networked, so there was Ethernet, and you could put stuff on network file system.
Okay, so NFS. Yeah, so you
Yeah,
just drag stuff over there and okay,
yeah. So
okay.
you could share stuff and so forth. But yeah, to do a code review in those days probably meant gathering in a room, and we didn't really have it's kind of common practice now to have like a room with a big flat screen in it and where you can project you can show code on the flat screen, and that really wasn't a thing then. So there
Well, and
were
laptops too, right? Everybody had desktops,
yeah
so it wasn't
everybody
like people
most
are carting laptops around.
yeah everybody at that everybody there had silicon graphics workstations which were literally required a like a dolly to move them. You couldn't even really pick them up. They were too heavy to lift.
And they're tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, those I think they're the high end ones were 50, $60,000 back then.
Jeez.
So a code review was a pretty onerous process in that point. You might have even had to like print stuff out and project it with a overhead projector, which 30 years later sounds really really terrible. It sounds almost like punch cards, but um, so anyway, the idea of making code review a normal part of our process was not welcomed with open arms and
Mm.
did not take off at that
Yeah,
time.
you got to twist arms to get people in a room and to give feedback on stuff that they're looking up, squinting up at a screen.
Yeah,
Okay, so you are still kind of in computational chemistry land, and it's like you really could have stayed in that maybe in your career here in San Diego. There's a lot of biotech firms. You could have gone maybe biotech's taken off in the '90s here. What were you thinking as you look ahead to your career? Did you have ideas of directions you wanted to go in, or how were you? What were you following?
yeah. At the time, I actually thought this was probably going to be my career forever. The group that I particularly worked for at that time did polymer modeling. And what I mean by that is like synthetic polymers that are used in things like making the casings for vacuum cleaners and
Forever chemicals.
yeah, yeah, plastics. What's that line from The Graduate?
Oh, he says, yeah, plastics.
One
He
word,
starts with plastics. I
plastics.
forget the next part. Go into plastics. The future's
Uh,
big in plastics.
but yeah, there's a lot of uses for polymers in commercial environments, and so a lot of the research that these people were doing were around using them, trying to find things with better mechanical properties, trying to save money, trying to make things work better. Like we had customers who were working on making the lenses for glasses. Anyway, I thought I'm going to be doing modeling forever. I'm going to be probably working in some material science aspect, and so I actually enrolled at UCSD in the material science program, graduate program.
To get a PhD?
Yeah, I initially enrolled in the master's program, and then my plan was to eventually get a PhD, and just basically continue doing what I was already doing, but in a more sophisticated way, I guess.
More letters after your name.
Yeah, yeah, I would have gotten the big dollars then too.
I didn't know that actually. You didn't continue that?
No, so I started off and I did most of the coursework for my master's, and I was working for this guy who he did what's called molecular beam epitaxy, and
Wow.
I won't go into that, but it had to do with basically making semiconductors. So I was kind of prepared to do research on modeling semiconductor surfaces. I was doing this while I was working, and I kind of overextended myself, and I got pneumonia.
Oh, that sucks. Too much stuff.
Yeah. Anyway, I won't dwell on the details here, but I had to drop out for a while because I was just so sick and tired, and I just never made it back.
Oh, okay. Okay. I imagine if you would have finished that, your career would have taken a different turn, though.
I suspect it would have, yeah, but water under the bridge. That's the way things go.
Yeah.
So, but this was my title was software engineer, and I learned all the nuts and bolts of software engineering, of that time. It's obviously a lot different now, but
Mm-hmm.
and there was sort of a different vibe then too. So, like one of the things that was kind of gaining popularity back in those days is the Software Engineering Institute out of Carnegie Mellon was promoting this thing they called the capability maturity model.
I think
Um,
I've heard of that before. Probably from you, though.
Yeah, I think it's still around. I don't know if it for a while, like in like defense companies, it was a really big deal. So you had to be certified as like CMM level 5 to be able to get defense contracts and stuff like that. But
You
the
know all the cool wizard spells when you get to that level.
yeah, exactly. I think the industry as a whole has sort of ignored it as time went by.
What was were there components of that you have to have code reviews, or was like software engineering practices that we're talking about?
Yeah,
Security?
yeah.
What
So
is
the idea was that if you're a level 1 organization that you have sort of minimal minimal tools and processes. And as you go up
A
as you
baby
go,
CMMI1, just a little baby.
yeah, as you go up the numbers, 2, 3, 4, 5, you develop more and more formal processes, and you have revision control and code review and design review and formal specs and all this kind of stuff.
Eventually, you achieve enlightenment on a software engineering
Nirvana,
sense.
yes, yeah,
Okay.
you
All right. Some
transcend.
people started ignoring that. So this is the 90s, and there is something macro level that's about to happen, right? I mean, you left 92. How long did you work at that job?
I was there for about 5 years as well, and then this is still in computational chemistry, but I had the opportunity to go to a startup, my first startup experience, and
Oh, something everybody, what would you think everybody should join a startup at some point? Would you agree with
um,
that?
I don't necessarily know that I would say that now.
Okay.
Looking
Okay.
back on it, I it's an interesting experience, but I guess two things that you have to sort of take into account when you're considering startup. One is that there's about a 99.999% chance that the startup you go to is not going to be Google. um, so there's a far greater likelihood that you are going to come out financially worse off than better off. So you have to take that into account. The other thing you have to take into account is that it can be stressful because you're almost certainly understaffed and you're almost certainly required to do things that you really didn't sign up to do.
Hmm.
So,
A lot of work, a lot more time, a lot more energy and effort than you might have anticipated. You said there's a 5 nines availability that you are not Google. So that means only 5 minutes out of every year will you potentially be working at Google, the startup.
something like that. Yeah. I learned some stuff, some good stuff, some
What,
bad stuff.
what kind
Um,
of stuff? Oh, let's start with the bad stuff. Maybe start with the good stuff.
so, the good thing, this was really the first time when I was totally in charge of a project. So, I worked there. There were essentially five of us who were kind of the core of the company. One of them was my best friend at the time, and he and I worked on the two main projects for building this product, both of which were supported by what are called SBIR grants, or Small Business Innovation Research grants. And
Hmm.
these grants had reached what they call phase two, which is the larger funding part. So we had about 2 years of runway on both of these projects. And I took the lead on one, he took the lead on the other. So it was really my first time starting from scratch and building something entirely greenfield. So
Which can be very satisfying. Yeah.
it's very satisfying, and it sort of became like my I don't know, not exactly, I wouldn't say specialty, but it sort of became my thing after that. Is going forward, even when I was working for companies that weren't necessarily startups, my what I sought out and what was often designated to me was projects that were starting from scratch.
Did you get good at showing up and saying everything you have sucks? Let me start over. This is what you're saying.
No, no,
I,
I
I
did
I
not.
don't mean to accuse you of that. I've worked with you. You don't do that.
I did eventually have, like, people to supervise and stuff like that.
Okay. So it's a pretty serious leap in your career. Doing stuff from scratch, leading a project. You've got people
Yeah,
under you. That's a
I
pretty big
I
change.
had to think a lot more about software design, since nothing was really, there was no template there to work from. There was nothing to sort of copy from.
This is still C, or is it you moving on to
It
different
was
languages at this
C
point?
plus. It was C plus plus. Still, we had two products. One was still on high end workstations, but the other one was a desktop product. It was a product for protein modeling, which is important in the pharmaceutical industry. So the desktop product was C plus plus on the Microsoft platform, and that was really my first time using C plus plus, and also my first time doing Microsoft stuff in anger, sort of, so to speak. the
You were using Unix before with SGI?
Yeah, the SGI was a Unix platform.
Even
Yeah,
not even Linux. Linux would have been born in 1992.
yeah, Linux was sort of around by then. My friend and I, who worked at this company together, often spent a lot of time hacking on Linux too. Like, in the good old days, you had to rebuild the kernel to get the
Hmm.
drivers for Wi-Fi, and
Oh.
So
In the good old days. I did that in 2009, trying to build drivers for a stupid Mac clamshell that I couldn't get it to. This is not anything. I'm going off the rails here. Sorry. I guess the other thing I want to mention for our listeners who haven't been in the field as long as you have, Linux feels like it's been around forever. But you were working pre Linux, and there was a moment at which it showed up, and then it started to gain more market share, and now you're doing Microsoft stuff. The point I'm getting at is a lot of this stuff is relatively young. We're talking 3 decades. It hasn't been around that long.
yeah, and Linux when it first came out was pretty primitive. I mean,
Yeah.
it was sophisticated enough that people were willing to contribute to it. I remember I was at the UCSD campus bookstore, and I found a Minix manual, which had the entire listing of Minix. And I always think of that when I'm thinking of Linux. That was kind of like the level of sophistication of Linux back in those days. But
You said you learned good things and bad things. You went to work. What was the year you started this company?
I think it was 97.
Right around .com boom starting to take off. You go to work for this startup. You're working C++. You're working on Microsoft, shipping to Microsoft PCs. You learn good things and bad things. You tell us a few of the good, maybe not all of them. Are there more good? What were the bad?
I think I've covered most of the good stuff. And it, like you say, it was kind of in the middle of the .com boom, and it was sort of surreal sometimes. So for instance, most of us at this company were alumni of the Supercomputer Center, and we were following the company mp3.com at the time, which was also started by a group of people from the Supercomputer Center. And
Hmm.
their story was also it's just kind of wacky. There were all these interesting stories about how they went to Tower Records and bought all the CDs, like literally $70,000 worth of CDs or something like that. It's a story about how they had like a T3 cable that was like strung over a road, and because they couldn't get anybody to dig a trench underneath this road. And anyway, but the weirder part about it, we kept hearing about all the funding they would get. So they were
Yeah,
getting
yeah.
like 12 million and 15 million and
There's a lot of fervor and frothiness at that time. I
frothiness.
remember I was very early in college here, around 1995, 96. There was a guy on my floor in my dorm who we weren't friends, but we were friendly, and I would talk to him sometimes. And I remember just standing in his room once. He was composing an email in Japanese and another one side by side in English, and I don't know how he was doing that. And a friend of mine made some comment to him about how the .com market was blowing up, and he said, "I could take my mom public right now and make $1 million." And I was just, this is my introduction to this world of .com, and we were in the Bay Area, and I was like, that is a weird comment that guy just made.
it,
And that guy ended up starting a company and selling it for millions of dollars.
it did feel that way, and there were tons of pretty bad ideas. So the bad part, somewhat comical but also bad, was this: our company did get some venture capital. I think
Hmm.
because of the frothiness of the market at time. Even though we weren't an internet company, there was a lot of capital moving around, and we managed to get a small amount of venture capital. There were a couple of things I learned about venture capital that I did not know before this. One is that when a venture capitalist gives you money, they don't want you to put it in the bank and be careful with it. When they give you money, they expect you to use it so you can grow as quickly as possible so that they can get an exit. They're not expecting you to be conservative with their money and spend it slowly and try to build the company slowly. They want you to spend it and grow so they can exit.
There's a lot of ink spilled about the pains of dealing with venture capital, and I am super naive to this area of our business, but it's scary, dangerous stuff taking VC money, is what I gather.
You have to understand what it means, I think, which I did not at the time. We had these SBIR grants and we were using them over a 2-year period. And I thought when we got the VC money, okay, great, this is more money that it's going to extend our runway beyond the 2 years that we have for these grants. And they were like, no.
But the SBIR grant's more like a hug. It's more like the Sesame Street version of
Yeah. And,
grants.
you are expected to do them over a couple of years, but the VCs want you to use the money to grow and to market they want to see you have sales and revenue and so forth. And the other part about VC that I didn't know going in is that VCs usually have preference in terms of getting their money back. So there were people who had invested in this company who were like family and friends of the founders. And we did have a sort of mild exit at the end of this after a few years. And, we were what would now be called acqui-hired, meaning, the company was bought for sort of a minimal amount with the understanding that we would, as engineers, be working for the company that bought us. But all of that money went to the VCs. None of the family and friends investors got a dime back, which I thought was a shame. Anyway, this is not like to impugn VCs. This is just what their business is. But if you don't
Mm-hmm.
know this going in, it can be quite shocking and harsh.
Yeah, it's almost like if you work at a startup, you're doing software engineering, you're trying to build a product, you've got this perspective on what your work is. You're trying to construct a thing. And when the VCs get involved, it almost, again, very outsider, naive perspective, it seems like you're not doing that. You're their casino. You're there to turn their money into a lot more money. And if you're not doing that, expediently enough, show's over. They're taking the money back out.
One of my favorite stories does come out of this time, though, which was after we got the VC money, the VCs encouraged us to hire this guy to be the new president and CEO of the company. So the guy who was the nominal founder sort of became the chief technical officer, the chief scientific officer, or whatever, and this new guy took over as CEO, and he didn't have any scientific background. His thing was sales and marketing, and we went to this trade show in San Francisco, and we had a booth, and we were going to try to show off our software and demonstrate it to people, and as you do at trade shows. And he was trying to figure out ways to lure people to our booth. So people are going through it's a big expo. People are going through the expo hall. They can't see everything. So what do you do to get them to come to your booth preferentially? So he hit on this idea that we were going to offer people free Girl Scout cookies. So I think it was partially because he had this niece who was selling Girl Scout
Oh,
cookies.
okay. Wow.
But he bought $1,200 worth of Thin Mints.
Okay. Okay.
So, and to be fair, it did work. A lot of people came to our booth for the free Thin Mints. Not that many of them stayed for the demos, but we we did move a lot of cookies. So
KubeCon, maybe 6, 7 years ago, there was some company that does CI/CD. I can't even remember the name of the company, and they were raffling off these massive Lego kits. They would give out raffle tickets. They'd be like, "Come back at this time," and then they would give everybody a demo and a pitch, and then they would do the raffle, and everybody would disperse. Those types of tricks and ideas are still going. So you worked for this company for a while. They got acqui-hired. Did you stick around once they got acqui-hired, or did you go to do anything? What did you do after that?
So I stuck around at the company that acqui-hired us for about a year. Didn't really dig it that much, partially because I had to make a lot of trips up to the Bay Area because they were kind of in the East Bay. So I actually ended up going back to the company that I had been at prior to going to the startup. It had been renamed in the interim, but I went back and ended up working on something that was quite a bit different. Even for this company, it was quite a bit different. It was a sort of project they had really never undertaken before.
Hmm. So it felt like a new job. It
And
didn't feel like settling back at this old familiar blanket.
yeah, it was a different product line, and the interesting thing about it, it was much more data oriented than it was modeling and simulation oriented.
Hmm.
In particular, our product actually did have a database backing it. It was Oracle, so my first exposure to commercial relational databases,
Hmm.
and it was also interesting in that it was a management job.
Oh, you weren't just
it
software
was
engineer, individual contributor anymore.
Yeah, I did do some work on the product. I did do some coding as much as I could, but it was, I was hired as a manager of a group.
Was there intentionality in that? Did you say, okay, I'm done. I don't want to be a software engineer anymore. I want to be a manager. I want to lead other engineers.
Yeah, I intentionally applied for a management role. It might have been what we call a technical lead now,
Mm-hmm.
more like doing a little bit of technical work and supervising other engineers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because of the way the company was growing, they were merging with several other companies over this period, and I actually kind of rose through the ranks, like unintentionally, but uh, my responsibilities kind of grew over a 2 or 3 year period.
And then why'd you leave? You weren't there for that much longer, right? Because maybe I'm getting the timeline a little fuzzy in my head.
Yeah, I did not last as long as I would have liked in that role. I can't remember exactly how long I was there, but the long and short of it is I got a new boss who was effectively the CTO of the company. And he was a guy who I had a little bit of a history with and was not a huge fan of. He worked out of the UK. He kind of did not account for the fact that he worked out of the UK. So he would, interact with me during his working hours.
Oh, wow. 8 hours ahead of us.
Yeah, I always tell this story, but sort of the kicker for me was that one time he called me at 2 a.m. in the morning, California time, to ask me to change a value in a row of a spreadsheet. Uh,
It's not quite a fire to put out, though, is it?
yeah, so anyway, I was there for about 3 years, I guess.
There's an old adage. People don't leave bad companies, they leave bad bosses.
It was still a good learning experience, and the team that I was supervising was probably the best team I've worked with. We had 3 PhDs on that team, and a lot of really good engineers. And the first part of it, before things went haywire, was pretty satisfying because it's both a good team and a very industrious team that did a lot of good work, in my opinion.
That's a nice feeling when you're in the flow with a group of people and you're getting stuff out rapidly and it feels like it's high quality. That's a very good feeling when that happens.
Yeah, yeah.
So did you apply for
I s-
jobs? Go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, I still am in contact with people from that era, and we have lots of good war stories. So.
Did you apply for jobs to leave that job? You were like, this boss sucks. This English guy who calls me at 2 a.m, I'm getting away from this guy. Did you start sending out applications? What'd you do?
I did. Yeah. I kind of made this decision that I had been working in these chemistry adjacent fields for a long time now. So I guess I'm trying to think of what year this would have been, but it's coming up close to 15 years working in since my time in the supercomputer center to this point. It was always at least connected to chemistry somehow. Which was my educational background, and I kind of decided at this point in time that I wanted to do something that was not related to that, so that I could, sort of satisfy myself that I was a real software engineer, and that I wasn't just, this guy who was getting by because I had this connection to the field that I was working in.
But so you were in management or like almost a lead role. Did you try to get another management role or a lead role? Or did you say, I want to go and write more software and I want to write software that's not chemistry related?
Yeah, I was really looking more for, I guess you'd call them individual contributor roles. I think my ideal situation would have been like a technical lead sort of thing. But yeah, I really wanted to write code, and I wanted to write code in a field that was outside of what I'd been doing so far.
What did you do then?
Well, I had a little bit of a misfire in there, but what I eventually ended up at it was a startup, but it was kind of a late stage startup in the music streaming field. And my role there was doing recommendations. The guy who hired me, he'd been doing this stuff. He had kind of inherited the recommendations stuff from another guy who had left the company, and he didn't want to work on it full time because he had lots of other responsibilities. So he hired me to sort of focus on the music recommendations aspect of it. And
This sounds intellectually challenging, like more of a data science type of project.
yeah, it was. It was a lot of it was engineering because we were essentially building services that would, serve recommendations, personalized recommendations, and this was all Java stuff.
Did you work with Java before that, or was this your first job working with Java?
I had worked with at previous job we'd started doing some projects in Java, so I was familiar with the whole Java enterprise stack.
Did you like it going from C to C++ to Java? Did you go, oh, yes, this is what I've been looking for?
I didn't hate it. I was fine with it. I thought, it was if you had been working in C++, Java wasn't too big of a leap.
That's funny because I wouldn't say going the other way. I think it is a big leap going from Java to C++. Am I wrong there?
Well, I mean, they're both
Curly brace
object.
infused.
Yeah, they're C influenced. They're both object oriented, although in slightly different ways. Probably the biggest technological change is going from a purely compiled language to a JVM,
Hmm.
to a virtual machine based language. And there were some differences in the way things were getting deployed at this point in time now too. So
Still
people are moving.
pre-public cloud though, right? Early 2000s.
Yeah, this we were strictly our own hardware, but this is now you're providing services on the internet,
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
no more shrink wrap boxes.
So you turn it off and turn it on again when you have a new version of the software.
Yeah, so this is where I started to learn about pushing things out to production servers and so forth. And
Hmm. So you're writing music recommendation systems. You're writing it in Java. You probably have databases you're working with now again. You're deploying stuff that people are accessing over the internet. This is a big difference. This is now the model that we've seen over the last 20, 25 years.
yeah, and another interesting thing about this was that the technology that we were using at the time for recommendations, which I obviously did not invent, was it actually used a search engine. There were two broad areas of recommendation systems then. Both of them were in what they called collaborative filtering, which meant that you would sort of kind of look at what you were listening to and then find other people who are listening to the same things.
Hmm.
The theory being that if you're listening to something and other people are listening to the similar things, then there might be things that they're listening to that you're not already listening to that you can recommend, that the
Wow.
recommender system can recommend to you.
So it's like a nearest neighbor type of thing.
In a way, yeah. The technology that we used was based on, it was originally used for sort of natural language work. So it
Oh.
was used for like identifying words that were co-located, so certain words that were used often together.
Hmm.
And the person who had invented this technology used the same idea to say, hey, these two tracks are often played together. You'd look for artists or tracks that were often played by the same users. And then you could sort of look across the whole user space or the whole item space and figure out what things were similar to each other in terms of people's taste.
Did that work?
It works pretty well. Yeah. A lot of the systems at that time were based on some variant of that. What Amazon was doing for books was based on that, and early Netflix was based on a similar idea.
But it's not like Spotify, right? You don't have this massive catalog. I imagine that would have been hugely successful. Plus, music pirating was happening at a huge scale at this time still, right? First there was Napster in the 90s, and then you went to BitTorrent in the early 2000s. BitTorrent was huge in the early 2000s.
Yeah, there was a lot of, this was kind of in a phase where people were still trying to get MP3s of music. So our company was nominally a streaming thing. We were kind of doing what would be kind of like Pandora, more like a sort of radio station idea.
Okay, okay.
So we were not providing downloads of music. We were essentially providing music streaming.
But it's all licensed. You'd have
Yeah,
to pay every time it gets played.
yeah. We had deals with the record companies, and every time somebody would play something, we'd keep a record of that, and we had to end up paying royalties to
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
to the record companies, as I guess still goes on today.
Why haven't I heard of this company, do you think?
Well, they got acquired by a certain large internet company out of the Bay.
Mm.
And as happened with many things that got acquired by this large internet company, we sort of got subsumed into their technology and nobody ever heard of it again.
Yeah. You don't want to name do you want to name the company? Tell me who it was.
It was Yahoo, but
So you worked for Yahoo after you got acquired.
yeah, I was working for Yahoo then, and I was the lead on music video recommendations.
But that sounds like a bit of a step up, right? You go from this startup to now you're working for Yahoo. You're the lead at Yahoo on music and video recommendations. I mean, that seems like a big mark in the career, right?
Yeah, it was interesting, and it was challenging because it was really the first time. Like, it's hard to, if you've come out of a background that is desktop software or a relatively small niche market, and going into something where you literally have a million users. Like the service that I worked on was not one of the major services for the company, but we still typically on a daily basis had 100,000 simultaneous users.
Hmm.
So there were 100,000, 150,000 people constantly hitting the service, and sometimes more at the peak. And
So you had issues of scale for the first time in your career, is what you're saying.
yeah, issues of scale and issues of latency. And this was, pre-cloud still, pre-auto scaling. And so we had to think a lot about capacity planning and things like that.
So how'd you solve these issues of scale? What were the surprising things that came out of issues of scale, and how'd you solve them?
So most of these services could be sort of horizontally scaled.
You just spawned more servers.
Yeah, so more servers was always an option. But again, keep in mind this is pre-cloud days. And so more servers meant literally putting more boxes into
Yeah.
a data center. And
You got to ask the IT department for more servers to put your stuff on. And
yeah,
they have a ticket, and they're going to take a while to get to it, and they're going to make sure you got budget for it, right? Big company concerns, I imagine.
there were two things that we usually had to go through. One is when we started a new thing, we had to go through, I think it was called the architecture review board or something like that. So they would look at your system design and say, okay, yes, this checks out, or no, you need to do things this way, or you need to use this thing. And then the other thing that we would have to do is we would have to go in front of what they called the hardware review committee. So, you'd say, I've looked into it, and with this amount of traffic and what we know about the latency of this service, we're going to need 20 machines, 20 machines with these characteristics. And
Mm-hmm.
they would say, well, that seems like too many. Can you get by with 5 or 10 or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
So there was sort of this like negotiation process of trying to. One of the interesting things about I had to do this a couple of times, and one of the times I was on it, one of the founders of Yahoo, Dave Filo, was on the hardware review board arguing with me about whether I really needed this many servers. And it was frustrating, but also kind of comical because this was a guy who at the time was worth $2 billion, I think.
He started the company, and he's like, Mike, I just don't really want to give you any more servers.
Yeah, I admire the commitment, to the company cost cutting, but it was kind of funny.
What about, other scale issues? Like, you must have learned quite a lot in that job. Yeah, you can horizontally scale, but then the next problem is databases. You had search servers you're talking about running on Lucene before. That starts to get bogged down.
Yeah.
Did you start thinking in terms of CDNs? Are you doing geographic load balancing?
Yeah.
If somebody calls in from Europe, you want them to get a European server. What other strategies did you use there?
So we did rely heavily on CDNs, being a streaming company. I rarely had to think about it, fortunately, on the recommendation side, because I did not serve actual media.
Okay.
I was just serving metadata.
Mm-hmm.
This was sort of the early days of CI/CD, people thinking about CI/CD. There wasn't anything formal out there yet. Yahoo had its own system essentially for deploying stuff.
But CI had been around for a while, right? Because it was like, hey, you want to push a change, we need to make sure that the whole thing still builds. That was the whole idea of CI, right?
Yeah, I think at this time stuff like Jenkins might have been in place. Yahoo had its own systems for this stuff, but the main service that I worked on was on 30 machines, and so we had this issue. At this point in time, you probably have all this infrastructure as code thing, and you'd have auto scaling and wouldn't have to think about it nearly so much. Not that it's simple. I mean, getting all that stuff in place is a difficult thing, but at that time, we literally had to go through this process of pushing out code to all 30 machines.
And a canary deployment's like, hey, let's deploy it in Romania and see if it still works.
And one of the things that we would do is that we would often have to do these like coordinated deployments.
Oh.
So like Yahoo had bought Mark Cuban's company, broadcast.com, and they served video and various other things for Yahoo. And so there were cases where we'd be on these massive conference calls with people in Dallas and people in San Jose and people in San Diego.
And it's the, okay, guy in Texas, deploy your thing now and tell us how it's going and when it's done, and then we'll do our thing. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. It was
that's
like,
horrible.
it was exactly, well, not exactly. It was analogous, I think, to like launching a spaceship. You'd have all these people like, okay, lock down those bolts or whatever.
Yeah, and
And
database migrations are extremely hairy in those cases too. You want to change the database, and something went wrong. You got to roll it back. You have databases in different places, so you got to like successively deploy and then successively roll back. When I worked at a large company, I heard comments about that. People were like, "Yeah, we were up all night. We got to 3 a.m. and we got to Germany, and everything failed. So we rolled back, and then
yeah, that was the nightmare scenario, was that you were like step 8 of 12, and for some reason your shit didn't work and you had to roll it back, and everything was a waste of time. And uh,
don't do
people
this,
were
kids. Don't do this."
people were mad at you. And
Yeah, not fun.
so
Every time I ever get invited to get onto a quote unquote deployment call, I just kind of hang my head in shame. Like, I don't want to do a deployment call. I don't want to be on a call for deployment. It's symbolic of these horror stories.
yeah, it's not something that I would want to do again, especially at that scale.
But you
But
look back on your time at Yahoo, how do you reflect on it? I mean, that's a big deal. Huge company, internet company. There's tons of questions we could ask about it. What's your overall summation of it? Like, you put that on your resume, and now people go, "Oh, this guy worked at Yahoo."
yeah, it was enlightening. I learned a lot of stuff that had not been necessary before. Mostly about scale. I spent a lot of time teaching myself how to do capacity planning, and I learned about queuing theory. And since I was doing music recommendations, I was spending a lot of time looking into the technology of music recommendations, which was changing a lot at that stage. I don't know if anybody remembers it, but Netflix had this big competition. I think it was 2006 or 2007. But one of my perks as being the music recommendations guy at Yahoo, was that I got invited to this conference once in Spain. So I was at this conference in Spain, and I met the recommendations guy from Netflix, guy who was like light years ahead of me, more sophisticated, more experienced. And he's talking about their technology. And then about a week after I had met him at this conference, Netflix announced this $1 million recommendations competition that they that
Wow.
they were going to run, basically to improve their systems. It inspired a lot of work, and the whole field of recommendations changed quite a bit over the next few years.
What was it like interviewing people at Yahoo? Was it like Google, where they've notoriously had how many golf balls could you fit in a 747 type questions?
No, we were not quite that rigorous.
Rigorous is the word you're going to use for that? The golf balls on the 747? That's rigorous.
So we did have sort of a coding whiteboard problem that we would ask people to do. Not a super difficult one. In fact, I think we've talked about in the past that we would ask people to do this subsequence problem. The
Oh, Cadanes. You told me
yeah,
the name of that thing.
right.
Cadanes.
We had a couple of other variations too. There was one about you're given a time and you have to figure out where to position the hands on a clock.
Oh,
So you're given like the time 4:30, and you have to figure out how to calculate where to put the hands on a clock or something like that.
that doesn't sound so bad. That sounds like when interviewing was still sort of reasonable.
Yeah, they weren't tough problems, but we did have them. And yeah, I mean, it was also interesting in that you'd get some people who were pretty impressive. We didn't always hire them, but since it was a well-known company that compensated well, you'd get some pretty serious applicants who would do things in the interviews that would impress you.
One thing about working with you, I worked with you far after your time at Yahoo. Well, we started working together probably in the 20 teens somewhere, like 2014, 2015, we started working together. And I don't remember you constantly name dropping Yahoo when we worked together. You didn't every day come into a meeting and someone would have a suggestion and you'd be like, "Well, when I worked at Yahoo," you're laughing because this is a thing people sometimes do. They go work at a large respected company, software company, and then forever afterwards they bring it up. How come you didn't do that?
Yeah, I always see people on like LinkedIn, they'll in addition to their current job, they'll always have like, ex Google, ex Yelp,
Oh
ex
yeah, Zoogler. They have their own term for that, Zooglers.
So I think part of it is that part of it's my nature. I'm not
Effusive. That's the word you're not.
yeah, I don't think I would impress anyone, and I don't really attempt to impress anyone. But the other reason is that Yahoo at that stage was not. I mean, I think it was in certain ways a prestigious place to work, and there were some really brilliant people there. But it was also kind of going through a patch where people could see that it was clearly declining and losing ground to Google in particular.
Yeah, they had that massive directory. You'd go to the Yahoo front page and it'd be like a zoo of links, like 1,000 links, and it'd be like, "You want games?" And there'll be like all these sublinks under it, and it just wasn't going to be the future.
Yeah, the time that I was there, they were trying to become an entertainment company. In retrospect, it's kind of surprising that they didn't succeed at it. So, like, they could have very easily built YouTube before YouTube if they had thought about it. But they had brought in people who were sort of from the traditional entertainment field, and they were thinking in terms of, well, we need to make movies and we need to make TV shows, and
Oh, interesting strategy, big
yeah.
strategy.
So, that was kind of how we fit in. My group fit in was we were part of the music part of their entertainment idea. They were losing ground to Google on search, and they had sort of famously decided not to buy Google. And Google was starting to build this infrastructure where they were sort of building what would become the cloud, and so provisioning new machines and stuff was not nearly the headache that it was at Yahoo.
You don't think you would have to go before a hardware board and Sergey's there like, "No, Mike, you can't have another server." You don't think they did that at Google?
No, I think they were already getting to the point where it was like, I need to spin up a virtual machine. And
Hmm.
and Yahoo was kind of behind on that. So, anyway, not to disparage anyone, but it wasn't really something where people were going to ooh and ah because you had been a ex Yahoo person.
So you don't think people gave you credence? You have that on the resume. You don't think people looked at that and went, "Oh, this guy worked for Yahoo. Okay, he must know what he's doing." Did that happen, do you think, when you went to later jobs?
I think at some places it did. I've basically worked in software as a service stuff since that time. And I think people understand that working at a place like Yahoo does give you kind of a unique perspective on scale and, architecture and things that are valuable to building stuff on the internet.
There's two aspects of your career. I want to ask you a question and I want to sort of advance a idea here. I think one of the reasons that I always like we get along, you didn't strike me as someone who was trying to, and this is not to denigrate that, but you didn't have a lot of ambition about making money or having a title or pursuing particular companies. I never really did either. And again, there's nothing wrong with that ambition. I'm not trying to disparage it whatsoever. But you just seem to me to follow your interest. Oh, this is interesting. Oh, I know chemistry. I want to work on computational chemistry. Oh, I'm tired of computational chemistry. I want to work on something else. Music recommendation. That sounds cool. Like, is that true? Is that a good characterization? Or was it much more accidental? Like, you strike me as someone who followed your interest.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Sometimes maybe a little bit to my own detriment. There were probably cases where I probably should have stuck things out a little longer than I did. But yeah, I've always kind of wanted to do interesting work more so than I wanted to. Well, like moving up the like management ladder. I was only interested in insofar as it allowed me to do interesting stuff. Just
Hmm.
like empire building never really appealed to me. I have also this thing where I once I get really familiar with the technology, it starts to
Get a little dull.
interest me less. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I know people who've stuck with the same stuff all through their lives, and then they end up doing sort of like almost groundbreaking things because they manage to to stick to that one field.
I met somebody at the big company I worked at once, and I said, "What do you do?" This is in an elevator, and they said, "Oh, I set up Jira for different organizations in the company." And I went, "Okay, but what does that mean?" They went, "Well, I if somebody needs it, I go and I set it up for them." And I just was in my head, like melting down, like, "Oh my god, I would cry if I did that every day. That sounds so boring." Like,
Yeah, I I get interested in new languages, and there were cases where, like, a lot of my motivation for going into music recommendation area was really to get into more internet based stuff as opposed to desktop based stuff. And when I got out of music recommendations, it was slightly intentional and slightly accidental. The Great Recession of 2008 was kind of a big accident for a lot of people.
okay, is that when you left Yahoo?
Well, yeah, it was when I got out of music recommendations. I'd left Yahoo about a year earlier to do another startup, but I was still doing music recommendations. I reached a point where, well, the company that I was working for virtually collapsed during the Great Recession, and so
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
decided to sort of change directions again, and decided I really wanted to work on Python stuff, and so took a job at a startup doing Python stuff, primarily just to learn that language and learn the ecosystem around data science and scientific computing in the Python world.
Is that where I met you, at that job?
At that job, yes.
So you mentioned 2008, 2009, started doing Python, wanted to do more Python. This is about right when I picked it up, but you had had a whole career, 2 decades long by that point, and I'm just getting started.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because my mom at the time, my mom was still alive and still pretty lucid at that point in time, and so I remember when I switched to that job, it was an individual, it was a programmer role and doing new stuff
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
small company, and my mom kind of jokingly referred to it as my retirement job. Uh,
Yeah, there is, from an outside perspective, a way in which someone could look at that and be like, well, isn't that a step down? You're going to go and be an individual contributor at this small company. It's not a Yahoo. It's not massive scale.
Yeah, and it was, it was in many respects a backward career move. I viewed it as a way to do new things that were interesting to me, and I was especially eager to stop doing Java stuff, which I had had enough of at that point in time.
I don't want to go there. Here's my question. So I said I had a comment and a question. Here's my question. When I started as a software engineer, it felt like I'd look around and it felt very youthful. It felt very young, the organizations I was in. It almost felt sometimes that there was like a lack of maturity and maybe like a pride in this. We're not grown-ups. We're going to have board games and we're going to have kegs of beer, and we're not grown-ups. We're just going to have fun and we're young, right? I remember having this feeling at the time, which persisted throughout my career. And it sort of distills down to this question: where are all the elders? In other words, where are the people who've seen some shit, who can tell us what we're doing wrong? I needed people who had your experience. I wanted those people. I wanted to go and say to someone, hey, I've got this idea. I don't know if anybody's talked about this or done this. Have you ever seen this? Those people were not present. And when I met you, I was like, where did all you people go? Where did everyone with your tenure disappear to? This is my question. I had this breath of fresh air when I met you. Like, yes, here's someone who's been doing this a long time. I have questions. Where, first question, where did everyone go? Why, and maybe my characterization's wrong. Maybe all those people went to big companies, and that's why at the beginning of my career, I didn't work with them. I don't know.
There are a number of factors, I think, some of which are pretty well known. I mean, the industry reinvents itself so often that experience is a bit devalued. Like in, say, 2008, 2009, when I was kind of shifting gears again, a lot of the industry was switching then from the co-location phase to the cloud phase. So,
Cloud. There were huge products built at that time: Twitter, GitHub on Ruby on Rails, Rails, Django. These things were massive.
right, and then the company that I went to was putting stuff on AWS, and which was not brand new, but still pretty new at that time. And we started using Puppet.
Infrastructure as code.
Yeah, the sort of ideas behind things like Puppet and Chef were relatively new then, and so I think part of it is that that keeps happening in the industry where things change significantly enough that having 20 years of experience is not worth the extra money that people are going to have to pay you for that when they can get, people fresh out of undergraduate programs who have to learn the same stuff that you have to learn to, put stuff in the cloud or
So cynically, I've written a bunch of Ansible and I'm looking at you and I'm like, here's a guy who used to ship shrink wrapped boxes. He's not going to help me with this Ansible.
right. So there's partially is that, there's all this new stuff to learn, and partially is that I think people have this perception that as you get older, you sort of ossify and you lose your ability to adapt to it, which is probably true to some extent.
Geez, is that what I'm looking forward to? Is that what's happening to me? Am I ossifying? I'm asking seriously.
I honestly don't know. I think it's probably slightly true, but also the effects of it I think are a little bit exaggerated. There's this idea that 25-year-olds have lots of energy and not a lot of commitments, so they're going to work really hard for you and stay late and eat the company food, and people as they get older they have kids and spouses and commitments that they have to take care of, and they can't give you all those hours anymore. It's part of our field. Like, I remember there was this famous case many years ago where a guy working at Google had sued the company over age discrimination, and
Hmm.
it was a pretty significant thing in the news at the time. And the part of it that was sort of, I don't know, discouraging was that the guy who sued Google for age discrimination was 40.
Oh, wow.
So, he wasn't like a
Jeez.
guy nearing retirement. He was a guy mid career who was saying that Google fired him because he was too old, and so,
Wow.
and I think there's still a lot of that in our industry, that this idea that, people almost treat it like a math. If you haven't done your best work by 30, you're not ever going to do anything good. And
Yeah, I hope that's not the case. That's scary to hear. I look to you as someone who has wisdom to share with me. That's scary to imagine.
yeah, I don't think it's correct. I believe that, you do learn things over the years that are valuable. One of the things that comes up on our show a lot is that's an interesting new technology. We tried to do the same thing in the 1980s, and it didn't quite work. So I'm curious to see how it's going to work this time.
That's why we started this show,
Yeah.
because I wanted those. I wanted those little nuggets of gold from the past. I wanted to unearth them.
So yeah, I think all those people, I don't know, they went into different fields. They went into management. They are installing Jira for people.
I mean, I guess I still do have that question. Where did they all go? Did they leave the field? If they're still in the field, did they go into management? If you're speaking to somebody today, maybe this is how we should end this. You look back on your career, 30 plus years. You're talking to someone who's in high school, who's interested in writing software, or college. They're studying this, or maybe studying something else, but they like writing code. Do you have any, I don't know, maybe advice is too strong a term. When you reflect on your career, how would you tell them to prepare themselves to enter this field?
It's very hard at this point in time, for reasons I think are probably obvious. There's such a sea change right now because of the AI issues, and will there even be people writing significant amounts of code in the future? But I guess if you are interested in that sort of thing, my take would be, one, do things that interest you. Don't try to do things that are perceived as necessary in the industry. If you're pursuing something because you think there's a lot of jobs in that area, there probably won't be a lot of jobs in that area 5 years from now. So just do things that interest you. And also, I think, do things that are hard. Don't just try to solve easy problems, because there are plenty of people who can solve the easy problems. And I think, especially as time goes by, the hard problems are probably going to be the only thing left for human beings to do.
Wow. Do what you are interested in, pursue what you're interested in, and try to do some hard things along the way. That's a pretty good summation, I think, Mike.
I hope I can live up to it in my remaining years.
Would you be afraid to have age discrimination if you were to go interview for a job where they didn't know you as this fabulous podcaster, Mike Mull?
um, well, I think I've kind of reached the point where I probably wouldn't even make it to the interview because of age discrimination. So
Mm,
people would look at my resume and see that I've been in the industry for 40 years and probably chuck my resume into the bit bucket.
that's a little sad.
Yeah.
Well, we had something inspiring and we followed it up with something sad. That seems like how we should end it.
Yeah, that's the story of my life.
Well, this has been Picture Me Coding with Eric Aker and Mike Mull. This week we heard the rest of Mike's career. And actually, we didn't even hear around 2009, you moved on and then you did a bunch of stuff. We became friends about 10 years ago, and I have learned a lot from you. Thanks so much for telling your story, Mike. I started our outro too early.
And now I'm a media celebrity because of my podcast.
You're an influencer. You're building your personal brand. All of these things that we're supposed to be doing as part of our hustle grind culture. Although we're not really making money. Although we do have a Patreon.
That's right. I think I probably have more influence on gravity than I do on social media.
Well, this has been Picture Me Coding with Eric Aker and Mike Mull. Thanks so much, Mike. It was a blast hanging out with you. Appreciate it.
Sorry to bore you with my story, but we'll be back next time with some fun computer science content.
Yeah, I think we've got some good episodes coming up for you this month and next month. So please join us in the future, friends, and we will see you later.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.